My name is Rae Campbell, and today I'm going to show you how to paint a really easy illustrative apple using these beautiful watercolor paints. Art and painting are not about perfection or creating perfect, precise piece of work. It's about having fun, being creative and practicing what you enjoy. I'm going to talk to you about the materials that I'm using to start with so that you can join in with me if you want to. I'm going to be talking to you about these beautiful paints and showing you how to paint this lovely apple step by step. DeepDeepLight recommend that you add a little bit of water to your paints before using them to activate that beautiful pigment. First up, we have cowslips. I'm going to use this as the base color. This is a beautiful, cool light yellow with a warm yellow granulation. Perfect for our base tone. Next up, we have rosehip. I adore this color. It's a juicy, vibrant orange tone, and we're going to be using this alongside the next color, which is contemporary vermilion. I've chosen both of these together because they complement each other well. Just look at those beautiful, juicy, jammy tones that are going to be just glorious with this apple. These are the first three colours that I'm going to layer up, but then we have the tones that represent the stalk, and for this I'm going to be using mustard, which is a lovely muted brown tone. But this is one of my favourites. Prickly pear is what I call a magical colour. I'm going to be talking to you about this colour a little bit later on, but when you add a lot of water to this dual granulating colour, magic happens, and you'll see as we work through the tutorial what I mean. Next up, we have rhubarb, which is a glorious muted green tone, and all of these colours together will form the stalk and the underside of the apple. But I'm going to be talking to you about these in detail as we work through the tutorial, and I can't wait to get started. But before I do, just look what happens when I remove a little bit of water with my mop brush. Already you can see that granulation on that prickly pear tone, which I adore. The paper that I'm using today is handmade from the Beetle sketchbook, and it's 100% cotton. Now, I have dabbled a little bit with this paper before, and I love the way that it handles watercolor. I'm going to be using a few brushes. I was going to draw my image out with my pencil, but I thought, do you know what? Art is about being creative and not being scared to get it wrong. So I'm going straight in with my ink liner pen. The paper is absolutely superb, and I have been playing around with it as I mentioned in the beginning. It handles watercolor extremely well and is perfect for all kinds of watercolor painting, and I'm going to be using it today in my journal. The apple is a fairly simple shape, so I'm not frightened to go in straight away with my ink pen. But like I said, even if I get it wrong, it doesn't matter. It's all about making marks on paper and just experimenting and just not being scared to make mistakes with your watercolor painting. That is how you learn. So we're not here to paint this apple perfectly. It's not about accuracy, but it's about expression and letting go of your expectations. And that is part of the pleasure. So I advise you to embrace your imperfections, make your own marks on the watercolor paper without being scared of making mistakes. I'm even drawing a double line around this apple because I think it gives it a lovely illustrative look. So first of all, we do our basic outline as I'm writing down here in my journal, and I'm going to be working through this journal throughout my tutorials here on DeepDeepLight. So the first thing we need to think about with all our watercolor paintings is our first wash. When we look at this apple, you can see this lovely yellowy tone underneath. I didn't want to pick a color that was too bright, and cowslips fitted the bill perfectly. Because it's a kind of muted, soft yellow tone, I don't have to worry about mixing other colors to get the correct shade. I'm using my number 4 size spotter brush, and I'm adding plenty of water to this little mix here that I'm going to take wet on dry directly onto the watercolor paper. The number 4 spotter brush is just the right size here, and you can see I'm using it almost in the way of a felt tip pen, really similar. It just makes application really easy, and if you have struggled with watercolor painting in the past, these little brushes are ideal for getting your first wash on and indeed building up your paintings. I'm going to take this cowslips color all over the apple. As I said, this is going to form our base layer. This tutorial is suitable for everybody, including beginners, so I urge you to join in with me today and just get painting and enjoy the process. And like I said, And I'll keep saying, don't be frightened to get it wrong. Just adding a little bit more of water to push that pigment into the outline, because watercolor does have a tendency to retract from the outline when it dries. You can see all these lovely tones on the apple here, and we're going to be mixing up rosehip next. This is this lovely orangey colour, and I'm adding it to the yellow tone. You could use it on its own or separately, but at this point it's still a little bit watery. I don't want that pigment to be too thick. Because the paper is still damp, when I apply the paint like this, you can see that it does have a blurred effect. And this is what I'm looking for at this stage. We're adding this wet on wet, or we're charging that colour up with this other colour here. And then I'm going in with contemporary vermilion. This vermilion is so bright and so juicy and so vibrant. You can see how it's blurring into that paper, which is exactly what I want it to do. Now, watercolour does dry a little bit lighter, so we need to continue to build our layers once our first layer is dry. But we need to get this first wash on so that we can see how our colours perform on the watercolour paper without being too fussy. Just pushing that pigment into that outline and letting it blur into that damp paint. Because this paper is handmade and it's 100% cotton, it does take watercolour very, very well. If you are using a cellulose paper to do this tutorial, just be mindful that sometimes you have to be a little bit careful with your application because you don't want that paper to disintegrate. Everything's completely dry now. It's taken about 20 minutes or so. So all we need to do now is think about our next layers. Looking at those gorgeous colours on the apple, I can see once again that we've got those vibrant tones. So I've cleaned out my palette and I'm taking another mix of rosehip and vermilion together. This time adding a little less water because I want that pigment mix to be a little thicker than before. This means that we have darker value. By adding a darker value means that we have less water and more pigment. I've sized down to my number 2 brush. This is a snowdrop pointed round, and again it's from Rosemary & Co. I'm also mixing a tiny bit of rhubarb along with that beautiful mustard tone that we see. To the left of my palette there, you can see that I've swatched up my colours from light to dark. I've started off with a dark mix, added a little bit of water and then a little bit more. That gives me tonal variation, and that is something I think is so important for your watercolour paintings because it does give them dimension. I'm adding rhubarb and mustard here to the stem that you can see me applying with my number 2 brush and straight onto the watercolour paper. Because the paper is dry, of course, it's not going to blur as it did when we did that first wash. Whatever's left on the brush, I'm going to take it into the little dent where you see the stalk meet the apple. This is the kind of greeny muted tone that we see on the top of the apple there. And again, this is our first wash, and we're going to be building on that a little bit later on when it's dry. By using this method of application with watercolour, it makes your paintings come to life because it gives them dimension. So we get in different shades as we work through. It's nothing to get stressed about. It's all super easy. It's all about letting each layer dry before applying the next. As I said, this is my number 2 snowdrop pointed round. It's a synthetic brush from Rosemary & Co. I love these brushes because you're able to get a little bit more detail. Again, everything's dry, so I'm just adding a little bit of water here and there to the apple where I want to drop in those red tones. So again, we've got rosehip as well as vermilion, and going over again with another layer. I'm applying this where I've dropped that water so we get that blurry look again, and I'm just doing this randomly all over the apple. As I said, it isn't about perfection or precise painting today. It's all about just having fun and experimenting with watercolour to see where that takes us. There isn't a right or wrong way with watercolour, it's what works for you. We all have our own way of painting, and we want to make it a normal procedure where everyone gets sketching and painting and not being scared to get it wrong, because I know there's a huge pressure on people to get things right and to get things perfect, but that's not what it's about. That takes the enjoyment out of painting. So just dropping in that gorgeous vermilion tone here and there, just adding a little bit of detail and nothing too fussy. And if you do find that you're getting a little overwhelmed with your painting, just pause, stop and walk away from it. Let it dry and then go back to it a little bit later on. Just using my brush, gently push that pigment into the outside edge, adding a little bit more colour where I feel necessary, and just making it gently blur into the paper using a little bit of water. Water is your friend when it comes to watercolour painting, because it just means that it helps that paint move around without it causing too many problems. The key is knowing how much to add, and that is something that comes with practice. You can see that I'm leaving a little bit of that yellow tone shining through because that's our base colour. We still want to see a little bit of that lying underneath the orange and the red tones that I've applied. Just using my brush and just dropping it in. I'm not following any pattern particularly. I'm just using the apple as a guide, and I'm not taking it too seriously. I'm just dropping in that colour where I feel like it. And then using water just to merge the colours together gently. I don't want to overblend them because I want to see that colour lying underneath. Now at the moment our apple looks like it's floating in thin air, so we're going to add a base for it to sit on. Just look at that middle colour there, prickly pear. You can see that dual granulation that I'm so obsessed with. I absolutely love it. This is a great colour for painting things like bark. You can imagine just seeing those pinky tones shine through. It's one of my favourite colours from DeepDeepLight. I adore it and I use it all the time in my paintings. By profession, I'm a botanical artist, so this colour makes my job so much easier. Now with all their paints, with all DeepDeepLight paints, you need to add a lot of water to get those paints moving, and it's no exception with this gorgeous prickly pear colour. I'm going to add water underneath the apple to form a base layer, once again wet on wet, where we want to drop that pigment. By adding this first, it helps that paint separate out on the paper and gives it this lovely, soft, blurry look that I'm looking for, particularly with a dual granulation colour like this prickly pear that I'm really, really in love with. Give it a little bit of mix on that palette because it does separate out, and then dropping in our first layer. When you first apply prickly pear, you'll notice that it looks just somewhat ordinary. But then once it starts to dry, the magic happens. You get this pinky tone that I've just showed you, and it just does the work for you. But you do have to add plenty of water to get this effect. I'm going to apply this colour and add plenty of water to the base to spread it out, and then I'm going to let it dry before I start to build up the colours again to form that base layer. But the key is lots and lots of water and not being frightened to trust the process. I know it's scary if you've never used watercolour before, but trust me, this really works. We're just going to be patient and let it dry, just gently moving that paint around with a little bit of water just to get it settled into the right place. I'm adding a tiny bit more prickly pear to the base here while it's drying, just to give it a little bit of a boost, and then I have to be patient, step away, have a cup of tea, and just let it dry in its own time naturally. Because this paper is 100% cotton, I have to be patient because it does take maybe a little bit longer to dry than a cellulose paper, but it's worth the wait, and I really, really love using this paper. It's just beautiful. I've gone back to my spotter brush here and I'm just pushing that paint around a little bit and then adding a tiny bit more of that prickly pear again to the base before we have to be patient and walk away from it. You can see by adding it wet on wet, we're getting that lovely blurred effect. And just dropping it into the base, tickling it around, mixing plenty of water in my little mixing jar there, and just moving it around where I want it to go, or roughly where I want it to go. We don't have to be perfect, we're just about applying paint on paper, as I said, without that worry of perfection. Okay, everything's dry now, and you can see that I'm going to be using these three colours again. And you can just notice how that prickly pear has settled into that base and looking really, really lovely. But again, we can add some more layers later on. So we're back to rhubarb and mustard and prickly pear. The three colours again, but this time notice that I've used a lot less water. Looking at the colours on the apple, you can see that there are lots of different shades and tones. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply rhubarb to the stalk. I wanted it to be a little bit more vibrant and stand out a little bit more, and using prickly pear again here and there. Because I've added a lot less water this time, you're going to get a different look. You're going to get a stronger tone without that granulation because it's the water that gives it that granulating ability. You can see at the bottom bottom of the apple, how beautiful those colours look, and it's such a joy to see that effect in. It's magical, and I absolutely love it. So with less water, you're going to get a very different look. So if you want to get that fluidity with your paint, remember, you need to add more water than you probably think you're going to need. Mixing these three colours just to add a little bit of detail where the stalk hits the apple, just to give it a little bit more dimension and the tonal variations that I spoke about earlier on. Prickly pears going on again, and you can see because I've used very little water, I'm getting a much harder line, which is what I want in this instance. But of course, I'm adding a little bit of water to my brush just to blur it into the outside edge of this apple. Taking my time, not stressing, not fussing around, just enjoying the process. If you join in with me, inevitably yours is going to be different to mine. We all have our own way of handling watercolour paint. So we're back to adding these vibrant tones that we see on the apple. Same two colours, we're using rosehip and contemporary vermilion. Again, this time using less water. I'm just using enough pigment, enough water and enough pigment to get it moving. We don't want it to be sticky or dry, but we just want it to be a nice vibrant tone. This time using the wet on dry technique, so I'm applying this straight onto the apple using my smaller brush. Use your favourite brushes. I really like the ones from Rosemary & Co. I've used them for a very long time, and I do like that ability to have better control with my watercolour painting. It does depend, of course, on the kind of paintings that you enjoy, but they work really well with these DeepDeepLight paints. I'm using my number 4 spotter brush here just to blend that in with a lot of water. Spotter brushes are round brushes, but they do have a shorter bristle, which makes application I believe a lot easier. I've used these brushes ever since I started painting, and I really love them because they give better control. And I know that watercolour can have a little bit of a bad press by being kind of difficult to handle. I just added a tiny bit more of cowslips there because I did feel that the underlying wash that we did at the start is now looking a little bit too light, so I've gone in with another colour, another wash of that beautiful cowslips. And again, I'm dropping in the red and orange tone as I feel necessary, and just enhancing that line at the back there with a little bit of that vermilion. I'm not really following the pattern on the apple because I want this to be a loose illustrative look. I don't want to be photorealistic this time, and I'm just dropping the colours in just to make it look apple-like, which is what we're all about on this tutorial, making art accessible for everybody. And it might be that you've never painted before and you can still join in with me here today and have fun with your watercolour painting without it being too scary. And I'm just continuing the process, building up those colours, as you can see. This paper that I'm using, as I mentioned at the start, is from the Beetle. The paper that I'm using is a Beetle sketchbook. As I said, it's 100% cotton, and it is my aim to make this into my watercolour journal. I'm going to be adding different bits of it as I work through my journey here on the DeepDeepLight's beautiful YouTube channel. So if this is something that you're interested in following me, if you're interested in keeping up with me, then continue to watch these tutorials here on DeepDeepLight's channel, and you can see me progress in my watercolor journal journey. I'm going to be sharing all kinds of tutorials with you, including swatching videos if that's something you enjoy, so be sure to stay tuned and subscribe to their channel. Again, we're back to prickly pear, one of my favourites, and this time we're going to add plenty of water as well as plenty of pigment. Now that means that the pigment has this kind of inky-like quality, and I'm going to go underneath the apple just using plain water because we want this to have that blurry effect as before, and I'm only adding water where I want to drop that pigment. I'm just adding a little bit more pigment there because I want this to be really vibrant, and I'm just dropping it in to add another layer of a strong colour underneath the apple where it hits the surface because I want it to be really sharp. I'm using this opportunity to just sharpen up the underside of the apple where we can see that shadow hitting, and just continuing the process like so. Gently removing that paint, gently manipulating that paint into the water, and I'm adding a few more details here and there where I want to accentuate the stronger colours like this. So I've just used a few colours today and run through them again. Cowslips, rosehip, contemporary vermilion, mustard, rhubarb, and of course, the one that I'm going on about all the time, which I love, which is prickly pear, one of my favourites. And you can see that pink tone underneath that colour that I showed you earlier on. Absolute joy to work with, one of my favourite tones. So you can keep on building up your colours until you're happy with. As I said, it's not about perfection, it's about giving it a go and enjoying the process. This paper works really well with this kind of painting, and it will take quite a few layers. And if you want to check that out, it's the Beetle notepad on the website, and all the links will be in the description if you want to check out that, as well as all the paints that I've used for this tutorial. Like I said, we've just got a handful of paints today, and you can achieve this gorgeous looking apple by just using a few colours and experimenting with watercolour without it being too scary or, you know, too worrying for you. So here we have the finished painting. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up below. We'd really appreciate it, showing your support for this tutorial today.